When a gang of men clad in leather jackets descended on a black farmer's land, they saw nothing more than a solitary figure standing amid sprawling fields, an easy target to be bullied into submission. To them, he was just another man they could intimidate, another life they could uproot to serve their agenda. What they couldn't have known was that beneath his calm demeanor was a retired Marine with a Medal of Honor, a man forged in the crucible of combat and unyielding in his resolve to protect what was his. The fields they sought to claim weren't just dirt and crops. They were the product of years of hard work. Their threats, laced with venom and arrogance, set the stage for a battle that would test not only the farmer's strength, but the unity of a community long accustomed to looking over its shoulder. As their destructive plans escalated, the farmer would be forced to confront them, not just with words, but with action. What began as a calculated display of dominance would spiral into a confrontation that would shake the town to its core. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The setting sun cast a warm glow over Elijah Carter's farm, stretching golden light across the fields of corn and wheat he'd planted himself. The farm was his pride, the culmination of years of planning, hard work, and a desire for peace. After serving 20 years in the Marines and earning the nation's highest military honor, he'd traded the chaos of war for the quiet rhythm of the land. But lately, that peace had begun to fracture. Elijah leaned against the barn, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as unease prickled at him. The incidents started small. A gate left open, leading to his livestock wandering loose. Then came the flat tires on his tractor, the irrigation system mysteriously tampered with, and just last week, his shed window smashed. He wanted to believe it was coincidence or random mischief, but deep down, he knew better. This was deliberate. His property stood out in the county, not because it was the largest, it wasn't, but because he was one of the few black farmers in the area, and his success hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd overheard enough murmurs in town to know some people didn't like seeing him thrive here. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd fought harder battles than this, and wasn't about to be intimidated now. As he turned toward the house, the low rumble of an approaching truck broke the stillness of the evening. Elijah's hand instinctively drifted to his pocket, where his folding knife sat. A beat-up pickup rolled to a stop at the edge of his property. The driver lingered, the truck idling noisily as its headlights cut across the gravel driveway. A voice, sharp and mocking, called out, "Carter, you don't belong here. Time to pack it up before someone does it for you." Something small flew from the truck window and landed in the dirt before the vehicle sped off in a cloud of dust. Elijah approached the crumpled note, unfolding it with steady hands. The message was scrawled in rough handwriting, "Sell your farm, or else." Beneath the words was a crude drawing of a burning barn. Elijah's lips pressed into a hard line. These cowards thought they could rattle him, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Turning back to the house, he resolved to prepare for whatever was coming next. Elijah Carter sat at his kitchen table, the crumpled note in front of him. The faint smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, but the warmth of the mug in his hands did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Martha leaned against the counter, her arms folded as she stared at the paper. "They're not even hiding it anymore," she said, her voice low but sharp. "What kind of people threaten a man just for owning land?" Elijah sighed, setting his mug down. "The kind who think they can scare me off," he replied, "but they've got another thing coming." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed her concern. She knew Elijah well enough to see the determination hardening in his expression. "I just don't want this getting out of hand," she said softly. "We've got enough to worry about without you playing hero." "This isn't about being a hero," Elijah said, his voice steady. "This is about standing my ground. They think they can intimidate us because of who we are, but I won't give them that satisfaction." The sound of gravel crunching outside made them both pause. Elijah stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the window. A sheriff's cruiser had pulled into the driveway, its lights off. A wiry man in his mid-40s stepped out, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat before heading toward the door. Elijah opened it before the man could knock. "Sheriff Grant?" Elijah greeted, his tone neutral. "What brings you out here?" Grant's gaze flicked to the crumpled note on the table behind Elijah. "Heard about some trouble," he said. "Thought I'd check in." "Trouble's one word for it," Elijah replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Had a visitor last night. Left that behind." Grant picked up the note, his brow furrowing as he read it. He let out a low whistle. "This is serious," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Any idea who might have sent it?" "No names, but I've got my suspicions," Elijah said. "You know the kind of folks who don't take kindly to someone like me running a successful farm." Grant shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "Well, I'll file a report, but without any solid evidence, there's not much I can do," he said. "These things have a way of blowing over." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Blowing over? You think this is just going to go away on its own?" "I'm saying you might want to keep your head down," Grant said, his tone cautious. "Don't go stirring up trouble." Elijah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone. "I didn't fight for this country just to come home and be told to keep my head down. I've dealt with worse than cowards who hide behind threats." Grant raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I get it, Carter. I do. But this town's complicated. People don't like change, and you've got folks riled up just by being here." "Riled up?" Martha interjected, her voice cutting through the room. "Owning land and working it isn't riling people up. It's existing. And if that's enough to make them mad, then that's their problem." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he placed the note back on the table. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Just be careful." Elijah watched as the sheriff left, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. He turned to Martha, who shook her head. "He's not going to help us," she said. "Not really?" "No," Elijah agreed, "but that doesn't mean we're on our own." The next morning, Elijah walked the perimeter of his farm, taking stock of the damage from the past few weeks. The broken irrigation lines, the flattened crops, it all added up to one message. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they pushed him off his land. By the time he reached the edge of the property, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the soft dirt. They weren't his. He knelt, running his fingers over the grooves, his mind already piecing together what it meant. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. "Elijah!" Martha's voice carried across the field, sharp with urgency. He stood, his gaze snapping toward the house. She waved him over, holding a small package in her hands. His stomach sank as he approached. "It was on the porch," she said, handing it to him. The box was plain and unmarked, sealed with thick tape. Elijah's hands tensed as he opened it, revealing a single charred piece of wood, part of a fence post, with a burnt word scrawled across it. "Leave." Elijah's eyes narrowed as he stared at the message. "They're trying to break me," he said, his voice low, "but they're about to find out just how wrong they are." He turned back toward the house, his mind already racing with plans. It was time to prepare for the next move, because he knew they'd be back. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over Elijah Carter's farm. He stood by his tractor, wiping sweat from his brow after another long day of work. The rhythmic hum of crickets filled the air, but a faint growl of engines broke the peace. Elijah turned, narrowing his eyes at the sight of 3 trucks kicking up dust as they approached. The vehicles stopped at the edge of his property, lined up like a blockade. 5 men climbed out, each wearing battered leather jackets, their bald heads gleaming in the fading sunlight. They moved with deliberate swagger, spreading out as if to claim the space. The leader, a wiry man with a red bandana tied around his neck, stepped forward with a smug smirk. "Evening, Carter," the man called, his tone mocking. "Nice little place you got here." Elijah stepped forward, calm but unflinching. "What do you want?" The man motioned lazily to the fields behind Elijah. "Oh, we just wanted to come by, check out the view, see how much longer you plan on sticking around where you're not wanted." "This is my land," Elijah said firmly. "Bought and paid for." If you've got something to say, say it. The man chuckled, glancing back at his crew. All right, I'll spell it out for you. You've got 1 week to pack it up and sell this farm. 1 week. If you're still here after that, things are gonna get unpleasant. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I'm not selling. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. You don't get it, do you? This land, it was never meant for someone like you. This town's not for you, Carter. Never was. One of the men, a thick-set brute with a jagged scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt. Yeah, you walk around like you belong here, like you're better than us. But you're not. You're just another uppity. Enough! Elijah's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the man's words. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on the leader. You can talk all you want, but it won't change the facts. I worked for this land. I built it, and I'm not going anywhere. The leader let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Worked for it? You think that makes you special? You're just a black man who got lucky. This land was never meant for you. It should have gone to someone who knows what to do with it, someone who belongs here. Elijah's fists tightened at his sides, but his voice stayed cold and even. What you're really mad about is seeing someone like me succeed. That's your problem, not mine. You're damn right it's a problem. Another man growled, stepping forward. His leather jacket creaked as he crossed his arms, his glare full of contempt. People like you come in, thinking you can take over, think you can live like us, act like us. But you don't belong. Elijah's eyes flicked to the man, then back to the leader. Belong? He said, his voice hard. I belong anywhere I choose to be. I fought for this country, earned my place the hard way, and I'm not about to let a group of thugs tell me otherwise. The leader's smirk twisted into a scowl, and he took another step closer. You think your medals mean something here? Out here, you're nothing but a target. And if you don't sell, you and that little family of yours might find out just how dangerous it can get. At that, Elijah's expression shifted, his calm resolve replaced by a flicker of anger. You come near my family and you'll regret it. The leader tilted his head, a mocking grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Oh, we're not here to hurt anyone. Yet. But accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Fields get trampled. Livestock wander off. You'd hate to see that happen, wouldn't you? The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in false courtesy. Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. You're wasting your time, he said coldly. If you're looking for someone to scare, you came to the wrong place. The leader stepped back slightly but didn't leave. Instead, he turned to his men, as if to gauge their mood. You hear that, boys? Carter here thinks he's untouchable, thinks he can stand up to us. One of the men sneered. Let's see how tough he is when this place is nothing but ashes. Elijah's fists curled so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, but he didn't move. He kept his voice calm, the sharp edge of steel behind his words. You've said your piece. Now you're trespassing. Get off my land. The leader didn't move, his grin widening. Or what? You gonna call the sheriff? We all know he's not going to help you. Elijah didn't answer, his silence more intimidating than anything he could have said. For a moment, the standoff stretched into a tense silence, the gang testing his resolve, their laughter dying out as they realized Elijah wasn't backing down. The air between Elijah and the gang felt thick, like the calm before a storm. The leader stood his ground, his smirk unwavering, his crew shifting restlessly behind him. Elijah studied their faces, scarred, sneering, and full of malice. These weren't just locals blowing off steam. There was something deliberate, organized, about the way they moved and spoke. You've said your piece, Elijah said, his voice cold and even. But I've got one question before you go. Who are you? The leader raised an eyebrow, then let out a low chuckle. You don't know. He glanced back at his men, who exchanged knowing smirks. We're just concerned citizens, Carter. Folks who don't like seeing things change too much around here. Concerned about what? Elijah pressed, his gaze sharp. A man working his own land? A family trying to make an honest living? The leader tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Call it what you want, but people around here don't like outsiders, especially ones who don't know their place." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Outsider," he repeated. "That's what this is about? I've lived here for years, paid my taxes, helped out in town when I could. That's more than I can say for most people." The scarred man behind the leader scoffed. "Doesn't matter how long you've been here. This town's got a way of doing things, and you don't fit." The leader chuckled again, but his tone grew darker. "You're asking the wrong questions, Carter. It doesn't matter who we are. What matters is that we've got a job to do. And right now, that job is making sure you understand what's at stake." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "What's at stake is my family and my farm. And if you think I'm going to hand them over because a few men in leather jackets decided to show up, you don't know me." The leader's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "We know enough. You're just another guy who thinks he's special because he's got a few medals on the wall. But out here, none of that matters. Out here, you're alone." Elijah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a steely tone. "I'm not alone. And I've faced men tougher than you, so if you're planning on making good on those threats, you'd better be ready for the fight of your life." For a moment, the leader didn't speak. His men shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Elijah's words settling over them. But then he grinned, the humorless expression of a man who thrived on intimidation. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said. "But guts don't mean much when your barn's up in flames or your kids are crying because they don't feel safe anymore." The scarred man laughed, stepping forward. "Yeah, you might be tough, Carter. But your family? They're not. You really want them to pay the price for your pride?" Elijah's fists curled at his sides, but his voice stayed calm. "You think you can scare me by threatening my family? You'd better think again." The leader leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We're giving you 1 week. That's more than fair. But if you're still here after that, don't expect us to play nice." Elijah didn't flinch. "You're wasting your time. This farm isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." The leader straightened, his grin fading. "Have it your way," he said, stepping back toward his truck. "But don't say we didn't warn you." As the men began to retreat, one of them turned, a malicious gleam in his eye. "You think you're tough now, Carter. Let's see how tough you are when you're standing in a pile of ashes." The trucks roared to life, their engines drowning out the fading light of day. Dust kicked up as the vehicles peeled out, leaving Elijah standing alone in the quiet aftermath. He exhaled slowly, his fists still clenched, as he watched them disappear down the road. Back inside the house, Elijah recounted the encounter to Martha. Her face paled as he repeated the gang's words, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of a chair. "They threatened the kids?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "They think they can scare us off," Elijah said, his tone low but firm. "But they've got another thing coming." Martha shook her head, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Elijah, this isn't just talk. They'll come back." "You know they will." "I know," Elijah said, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "That's why we need to be ready." The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields as Elijah Carter walked the perimeter of his farm. His boots crunched against the dirt, the weight of the gang's threats lingering in his mind like a storm cloud. Every broken irrigation pipe, every scarred patch of earth felt like a message, a declaration that the battle for his land had already begun. Elijah stopped at the barn, running his hand over the smooth, freshly painted wall. The memory of the hateful slur that had been scrawled there weeks ago still burned in his mind, though the paint had long since covered it. These men weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted him gone, erased from the land he had built with his own hands. He reached the edge of the field, where the fresh tire tracks from the gang's trucks were still visible in the dirt. He crouched, running his fingers over the grooves, his sharp eyes studying the pattern. They hadn't bothered to hide their presence. They wanted him to know they were watching. As he stood, Martha's voice called out from the house, "Elijah! Breakfast is ready." He nodded, and made his way back, his mind already racing with plans. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and fried eggs filled the air, but Martha's usual warmth was missing. She stood at the counter, her arms crossed, her face drawn with worry. "They'll come back," she said, breaking the silence as Elijah poured himself a cup of coffee. "You know they will." Elijah set the mug down, his gaze steady. "I know. So, what are we going to do?" Martha pressed, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to show up again." Elijah leaned against the counter, his expression calm but resolute. "We're not going to sit here. But we're not running either." Martha's eyes filled with frustration. "Elijah, this isn't like the military. We don't have backup or reinforcements. It's just us." Elijah met her gaze, his voice firm. "I know what I'm doing, Martha. I've faced worse than this. These men think they can bully us because they've never met anyone who will stand up to them. That's their mistake." Martha shook her head, her voice rising. "But what about the kids? What if they won't," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady but cold. "I won't let them." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Martha's shoulders sagged. She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling. I don't want to lose this, Elijah. This farm, this life. We've worked so hard for it." Elijah stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to lose it," he said softly. "I promise you that." Later that day, Elijah drove into town, his truck rumbling down the narrow streets. The town square was quiet, the usual hum of activity subdued. As he parked near the hardware store, a few locals cast glances his way. Some curious, others wary. He ignored them, his focus on gathering what he needed. Inside the store, Elijah loaded his cart with nails, wood planks, and other supplies. As he reached for a roll of barbed wire, the clerk behind the counter cleared his throat. "Building something." Elijah glanced at the man, a middle-aged figure with a skeptical look. "Just some repairs," he replied. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Heard you've been having some trouble out there." Elijah paused, meeting the man's gaze. "Word travels fast." The clerk shrugged. "Small town, people talk. You sure it's a good idea, staying out there? Some folks don't like change." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not running from it either." The clerk nodded slowly, though his expression remained doubtful. "Well, good luck to you." Back at the farm, Elijah spent the afternoon reinforcing the property. He repaired weak spots in the fence, fortified the barn doors, and strung the barbed wire along vulnerable areas. Sweat poured down his face as he worked, the physical labor grounding him, giving him a sense of control in the face of uncertainty. As the sun began to set, he stood back, surveying his work. The farm wasn't a fortress, but it was ready, and so was he. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Martha, the kids already asleep inside, the quiet of the night felt heavier than usual. Martha leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you really think we can stop them?" Elijah's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fields stretched endlessly into the dark. "We don't have a choice," he said. "This is our home, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." The next day, the streets of town bustled with quiet activity as Elijah parked his truck near the grocery store. He stepped out, his boots scuffing against the pavement, and scanned the area. The familiarity of the place was both a comfort and a reminder of how unwelcome he had always been to some. He wasn't here for pleasantries. There were supplies he still needed, and his mind was focused on preparing for whatever came next. As he walked toward the store, a low chuckle cut through the air, stopping him in his tracks. "Well, if it isn't Carter," a mocking voice called out. Elijah turned slowly, his eyes landing on the same gang from his farm, now leaning against the side of a truck parked across the street. The leader, his red bandana hanging loose around his neck, smirked as he pushed off the vehicle and sauntered toward Elijah. "Clock's ticking," the leader said, his voice carrying just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. 5 days left, Carter. You making any progress on that packing?" Elijah stood tall, his expression unreadable. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied calmly. though his tone carried a weight that cut through the gang's smug demeanor. The leader's grin widened. "Oh, I think you will. You just haven't figured it out yet." The men behind him laughed, their voices low and taunting. Elijah's eyes flicked to the bystanders, a mix of locals pretending not to notice, and a few glances of silent support. But what caught his attention most was a middle-aged black man standing a few feet away, frozen in place as he watched the exchange. One of the gang members, a thick-set man with a scar running along his cheek, noticed the man as well. He sneered, turning his attention to him. "What are you staring at, old man? Got a problem?" The man, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and carrying a small bag of groceries, flinched but didn't reply. The gang member stepped closer, towering over him. "Maybe we need to remind you too. This ain't your town. Leave him alone," Elijah said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. The leader turned back to Elijah, chuckling. "What's the matter, Carter? You think you're the only one we've been checking in on?" He gestured lazily toward the man. "You're not special. There's plenty of folks around here who don't know their place." The gang's laughter echoed through the street, but Elijah's mind was already racing. He turned to the man as the gang sauntered off, their threats lingering like a bad smell. "You all right?" Elijah asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "They've been around a lot lately." Elijah frowned. "You too?" The man glanced around, as if checking to make sure the gang was really gone. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "Me and a few others. They've been showing up at people's homes. Threats, vandalism, you name it." Elijah's stomach tightened. He had suspected he wasn't the only one, but hearing it confirmed lit a spark of anger deep within him. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" he asked. "What good would it do?" the man replied bitterly. "The sheriff's not going to help us, and most folks around here don't care." Elijah nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we just sit back and take it." The man studied Elijah for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "What do you have in mind?" That evening, Elijah hosted a quiet meeting at his farm. The sun was dipping below the horizon as a handful of black families gathered around his kitchen table. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Some faces were familiar, neighbors and locals Elijah had known for years, but others were strangers, united now by a shared fear. "They've been going after all of us," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, "one by one, threatening us, trying to scare us off. But we're stronger together than we are alone." "Stronger?" an older woman scoffed. "What do you suggest, Carter? We fight them? We've got kids to think about, families?" Elijah nodded. "I understand. But sitting back and hoping they stop won't work. They're not going to stop unless we make them." "What can we even do?" another man asked. "They've got numbers. They've got the sheriff on their side." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've faced men like them before. Bullies who think they can take what they want because no one stands up to them. We don't have to fight them head-on, but we can protect what's ours, fortify our homes, look out for each other, share information. They're organized, but so can we." The room fell quiet, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. Slowly, heads began to nod. "You're right," the first man said, his voice steady now. "We've put up with this long enough. It's time we stood together." "Damn right," another chimed in. By the end of the meeting, a plan was taking shape. The families agreed to keep watch over each other, to share resources and stay in constant communication. Elijah offered to use his farm as a safe gathering point, a place where they could regroup if things escalated. As the families filed out into the night, Elijah stood on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the road. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The gang might think they had the upper hand, but they had underestimated the strength of a community determined to stand its ground. The morning sun cast long shadows over Elijah Carter's farm as he worked with quiet determination, hammering boards into place along the fence. Each strike of the hammer seemed to echo the gang's threats in his mind, a grim reminder of the danger that loomed. His phone, tucked into his back pocket, suddenly buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered. "Elijah!" James Harris's voice was frantic, panicked. "They're here! The gang! They're tearing my place apart!" Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "What are they doing?" "Everything. They've got bats, chains. They're smashing windows, breaking the fence." James's words came in bursts, his breathing labored. "My wife's crying, and I can't stop them. I don't know what to do." Elijah felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "Lock the doors, keep your wife safe, and don't go outside. I'm on my way." He hung up, his movements swift and precise as he threw his toolbox into the back of his truck. His mind raced as he climbed into the driver's seat, adrenaline coursing through him. As the engine roared to life, he gripped the wheel tightly and sped out of the driveway. The narrow country roads blurred past him, each turn a countdown to what awaited him at James's property. The Harris property came into view, and Elijah's chest tightened at the sight of chaos. The gang was everywhere. Their trucks were parked in the yard, engines idling like sentinels. 4 men moved across the property with deliberate malice, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. One of them swung a bat at a wooden fence, splinters flying with each strike, while another hurled a planter across the porch, shattering it against the wall. Broken glass and debris littered the ground. The leader, his red bandana loose around his neck, stood with his arms crossed near the front door, barking orders like a general commanding his troops. "Tear it down! Let 'em know we don't want 'em here!" Elijah parked just outside the gate, stepping out of his truck with slow, deliberate movements. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the destruction. His hand drifted to his toolbox in the truck bed, pulling out a crowbar. He wasn't just angry, he was ready to fight. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel drew the gang's attention. The leader turned, his smug grin spreading as he motioned for his men to stop. "Well, look who showed up. Carter, you're just in time to see what happens when people don't take us seriously." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on the leader. "You've made your point. Now get the hell off this property." The leader chuckled, his men laughing along with him. "Point? Oh, we're just getting started. You see, Carter, this isn't just about one family. This is about all of you thinking you can stick around where you're not wanted." One of the men, the burly figure with the chain wrapped around his fist, sneered. "You think showing up here changes anything? You're outnumbered, Carter. Walk away while you still can." Elijah's grip tightened on the crowbar, his voice sharp. "Outnumbered or not, you've got 2 choices. Leave now, or I'll make you leave." The leader's smirk twisted into a sneer as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "You think you can take us all on? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't protect your friends or your family." Elijah's stomach tightened, his mind racing. "What the hell are you talking about?" The leader motioned lazily toward the property. "You think this is just about Harris? Nah, Carter. We've got eyes on all of you. You might fight us here, but while you're busy playing hero, what happens to the others? What happens to your wife while you're over here swinging that crowbar?" The words hit like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, Elijah froze. He thought of Martha, of the other families who had come to his farm the night before. The gang wasn't bluffing. They were organized, relentless, and they had the numbers to back their threats. "You're cowards," Elijah said, his voice low and cold. "Going after families, threatening women. What does that prove? That you're scared of a fair fight?" The leader laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Fair fight? Carter, this isn't a fight. This is us reminding you who's in charge." For a moment, the tension crackled in the air like static. Elijah's muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to fight, to swing the crowbar and drive them off. But the gang's numbers, their threats, were too calculated. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone. The leader leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got 5 days, Carter. If you're smart, you'll pack up and get out while you still can." The air around the Harris property felt suffocating, heavy with tension and fear. Elijah Carter stood still, gripping the crowbar tightly in his hand as the gang loitered, their malicious grins cutting through the quiet. James Harris remained hidden inside, his face pale behind the curtains. Elijah's mind raced, torn between the instinct to fight and the realization that the gang wasn't bluffing about the scope of their threats. The leader, his red bandana now tied snugly around his neck, tilted his head as he sauntered closer to Elijah. The smirk on his face deepened with every step, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn ground. He stopped just inches from Elijah, his voice dropping to a low, mocking drawl. "Look at you, Carter. All fired up like you're gonna do something." Elijah held his ground, his eyes locked on the man. "I told you to leave." The leader chuckled, leaning in closer until his face was level with Elijah's. "Leave? Oh, we'll leave when we're good and ready. But first, I want you to hear me loud and clear." Elijah didn't flinch, though his grip on the crowbar tightened, his knuckles white. The leader's grin widened as he leaned in even further, his breath hot with malice. "There's nothing you can do. You hear me? Nothing. You can't save him," he said, motioning toward the house. "And if you ever think about coming around to save anyone else, well," he trailed off, the threat hanging in the air like poison. "Let's just say we'll do more than smash up a few fences next time." One of the other men, the scarred brute with the chain wrapped around his fist, stepped up beside the leader, his sneer just as cruel. "You think you're tough, Carter? Playing hero? Try it again, and we'll see how tough you really are." Elijah's chest burned with rage, his teeth clenched so tightly it hurt. His instincts screamed at him to swing, to fight back, to prove that their threats didn't scare him. But as he glanced at the destruction around him, the shattered windows, the broken fences, and thought of the other families, of Martha, he knew he couldn't risk it. Not yet. The leader must have seen the conflict in Elijah's eyes, because his grin grew even more smug. He took a deliberate step back, spreading his arms as if to declare victory. "That's what I thought," he said, loud enough for his men to hear. "You're all the same. All bark, no bite." The gang burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the yard like a cruel chorus. They turned, climbing into their trucks with exaggerated slowness, their movements dripping with mockery. The leader paused before getting into the driver's seat, his gaze flicking back to Elijah, one last time. 5 days, Carter. Remember that." With a roar of engines, the trucks peeled out, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the wreckage of the Harris property. Their laughter faded as they disappeared down the road, but the weight of their presence lingered. As the dust settled, Elijah exhaled slowly, his body still coiled with tension. He turned toward the house, where James and his wife had cautiously stepped onto the porch. James's face was pale, his hands trembling as he surveyed the damage. "Elijah!" James's voice was shaky, his words barely audible. "What are we going to do?" "They're not going to stop." Elijah looked at him, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to break us, but they're not going to win." James shook his head, his voice rising with desperation. "You saw what they did. You heard what they said. They'll come after all of us, Elijah. They won't," Elijah said firmly, cutting him off. "Not if we stick together. Not if we're ready." James fell silent, though his expression remained doubtful. Elijah's gaze swept over the wreckage again, the anger in his chest simmering into resolve. The gang might have had the upper hand today, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We'll rebuild," Elijah said, more to himself than anyone else. "And next time, they won't catch us off guard." The air around the Harris property hung heavy with the aftermath of the gang's departure. The wreckage left behind, shattered windows, splintered fences, and crushed flower beds, spoke volumes about their intent. Elijah stood in the yard, his arms crossed, his mind racing. The gang's words still rang in his ears, a sinister reminder of their next move. James Harris approached cautiously, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Elijah," he began, his voice unsteady, "they're going to come back, aren't they? Not just here, but everywhere." Elijah turned to him, his gaze sharp but steady. "Yes," he said simply, "they will." James's shoulders sagged, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. "I don't know if we can handle this. They've got numbers, they've got weapons, we're just farmers." Elijah shook his head. "We're not just anything. They're trying to scare us into thinking we're weak, but we're stronger together than they realize." James's eyes darted to the damage around him. "What do we do? Wait for them to pick us off one by one?" "No," Elijah said firmly. "We're not waiting. We're changing the plan." James frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. "They want to fight? Then we fight. But we do it on our terms. We're going to bring everyone to my farm. Every family they've threatened. Every person who's willing to stand with us. If they want to come for me, they're going to find all of us waiting." James blinked, stunned. "You're talking about a trap." Elijah nodded. "Exactly. They think they've got the upper hand because they're organized. But so can we. We'll fortify the farm, set up defenses, and when they come, we'll be ready." "But," James hesitated, "what if it's not enough? What if they bring more men?" Elijah's gaze hardened. "Then we fight harder. This isn't just about one farm, James. It's about all of us. If we let them win here, they'll keep going until we're all gone." James exhaled shakily, the weight of Elijah's words settling on him. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay, I'll call the others. We'll be there." That evening, Elijah stood in his kitchen, the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the window. The room was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the clock, but his mind buzzed with activity. Plans, strategies, and contingencies swirled in his thoughts as he prepared for what was to come. Martha entered the room, her arms crossed. "James called," she said. "He told me what you're planning." Elijah glanced at her, his expression calm but resolute. "It's the only way." Martha's brow furrowed. "You're putting everyone in one place. What if they bring more men? What if someone gets hurt? Or worse?" Elijah set down the blueprint he'd been sketching, a rough map of his farm with key points marked for defense. "If we don't stand together now, they'll pick us off one by one. This is our best chance." Martha leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm scared, Elijah." "I know," he said, stepping closer and placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "I am too, but we can't let fear stop us. They're counting on us to give up, to back down. If we do that, they win." Martha nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "What do you need me to do?" Elijah gave her a small, grateful smile. "Help me prepare the house. If it comes to it, we'll need a safe space for the kids and anyone else who can't fight." By nightfall, families began arriving at the farm. Trucks and cars pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Men, women, and even teenagers stepped out, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Some carried tools, hammers, shovels, even pitchforks, while others brought supplies, food, water, and first aid kits. Elijah stood on the porch, watching as his neighbors filed in. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the weight of what they were about to face. But he also saw something else: resolve. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "I know you're scared. I am too. But this is our home, and we're not going to let anyone take it from us." One of the men, a burly farmer named Henry, stepped forward. "What's the plan, Elijah?" Elijah motioned to the map spread out on the porch railing. "We're going to fortify the property, build barricades, reinforce the fences, and set up watch points. When they come, we'll be ready." "What about weapons?" a younger man asked. "They've got bats and chains. What do we have?" Elijah's gaze swept over the group. "We have each other. We use what we've got. Tools, farm equipment, anything that can be used to protect ourselves. And we use our wits. This isn't about meeting them blow for blow. It's about outsmarting them." The group nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Slowly, the tension began to shift. Fear gave way to purpose, and uncertainty turned into determination. Elijah looked out over his community, his jaw set. This is our land, our homes, and we're going to fight for them. The first light of dawn broke over Elijah Carter's farm, bathing the fields in soft gold. But there was no time to appreciate the calm beauty of the morning. The air buzzed with activity as men and women worked together, fortifying the property. The usual sounds of farm life were replaced by the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the scrape of shovels against dirt, and the occasional murmur of quiet conversation. Elijah stood in the center of the yard, overseeing the preparations. His sharp eyes tracked every movement, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The families who had gathered the night before were spread out across the property, working with quiet determination. "Reinforce the barn doors," Elijah called out to a group of men carrying heavy wooden planks. "If they try to break in, make it as hard as possible for them." Henry, the burly farmer who had stepped forward the night before, nodded and gestured to the others. "You heard him. Let's get this done." Elijah turned to another group, this one made up of teenagers and younger adults. They were digging trenches along the perimeter, their hands blistered, but their resolve unshaken. "Keep those trenches narrow but deep," Elijah instructed. "They'll slow down anyone trying to rush the fences." Nearby, Martha and a few other women were organizing supplies. They had set up a makeshift command center on the porch, with stacks of water bottles, food, and first aid kits. Martha's hands moved deftly as she sorted through the items, but her face was drawn, her worry evident in the tight line of her mouth. "Elijah!" she called out, motioning him over. "We've got enough supplies to last for a few days if it comes to that. But the first aid kit is looking thin." Elijah nodded, his gaze flicking to the horizon. "We'll make do with what we've got. Hopefully, this won't last long." Martha placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Elijah met her eyes, his expression softening for a brief moment. "I promise." By mid-morning, the farm was beginning to look more like a fortress. The fences had been reinforced with barbed wire and extra planks, while the barn and house had been fortified with heavy wooden beams. Strategically placed piles of hay bales served as cover, and the trenches around the perimeter were nearly complete. James Harris approached Elijah, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's coming together," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "But do you really think this will be enough?" Elijah glanced around, taking in the sight of his neighbors working side by side. "It has to be," he replied. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait." James hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. At least we're not sitting ducks anymore." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the mood on the farm shifted. The initial flurry of activity gave way to an uneasy stillness as the preparations neared completion. The families gathered in small groups, sharing quiet conversations and casting wary glances at the road leading to the property. The tension was palpable, the weight of what was coming pressing down on everyone. Elijah stood on the porch, scanning the horizon. His crowbar leaned against the railing, a silent reminder of what was at stake. Henry joined him, carrying a shovel over one shoulder. "You think they'll come tonight?" Henry asked, his voice low. Elijah didn't look away from the road. "If not tonight, then soon. They're not the type to wait long." Henry nodded grimly. "Well, we'll be ready." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah called everyone together. The group gathered in the yard, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns. The air was heavy with anticipation, but also with a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. Elijah stepped forward, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "You've all done an incredible job today. Look around you. This is what they're afraid of. Not the fences or the trenches, but us standing together." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the group. Elijah continued, his tone firm. "They'll come thinking they can intimidate us, that they can break us. But we're not going to let that happen. This is our home, our land, and we're going to show them what happens when they try to take it from us." The group broke into applause, a small but powerful show of determination. Elijah stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He felt the weight of their trust, their hope, and their fear, and he knew he couldn't let them down. As the families settled in for the night, taking shifts to keep watch, Elijah stood on the porch, his crowbar in hand. The stars above seemed brighter than usual, their light stark against the darkness of the night. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The trap was set. Now, all they could do was wait. The stillness of the early dawn was broken by the low growl of engines rumbling down the dirt road leading to Elijah Carter's farm. The sound carried across the fields, waking those who had fallen into uneasy sleep and jolting those on watch into high alert. From the porch, Elijah narrowed his eyes as headlights cut through the pre-dawn mist, the unmistakable roar of multiple trucks sending a chill through the air. "They're here," one of the men whispered, his voice tense. Elijah gripped his crowbar tightly, his gaze steady. He'd expected them, but not this soon. The gang was early, too early, and there were more of them than before. 5 trucks pulled up in a loose formation, their engines roaring as they skidded to a stop. Doors slammed, and nearly a dozen men climbed out, their leather jackets gleaming in the faint light. From the lead truck, the familiar figure of the gang's leader emerged, his red bandana tied tightly around his neck. He glanced around the farm, his expression darkening. "Where are the others, Carter?" he called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Thought you'd have your little community here to back you up." Elijah stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved to meet the gang halfway. "They're not your concern," he said, his voice steady. "You've already done enough damage. Turn around and leave." The leader laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Turn around? After coming all this way?" "Nah, Carter, we're just getting started." He motioned to the men behind him, who fanned out, some carrying bats, others chains, and one with a crowbar slung over his shoulder. "Figured you'd get brave and try to pull something, so we brought a few extra friends to make sure you understand how things work around here." Elijah's jaw tightened, his grip on his own crowbar firm. "This is my farm, my land, and I'm not going anywhere." The leader's smirk widened. "You really think you can stand against us? You're just one man, Carter. And you can't fight all of us." "I don't need to fight all of you," Elijah said coldly. "But if you think I'll let you take this land without a fight, you're dead wrong." The leader's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. "Tough talk. Let's see if you can back it up." The gang began to advance, their boots crunching against the gravel as they spread out across the yard. Elijah stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. From behind the barn and the surrounding shadows, faint movements hinted at the families hiding in wait, ready to spring into action. The plan was set, and the trap was ready to be sprung. "You think you're clever, Carter?" The leader spat, stepping closer until he was inches from Elijah's face. "Trying to get everyone to band together like you're some kind of hero? You're not a hero. You're just a stubborn old man who doesn't know when to quit." Elijah didn't flinch. Better to be stubborn than a coward who hides behind a gang. The leader's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching as though itching to strike. "Careful, Carter. You might just regret those words." The tension snapped like a bowstring as one of the gang members, a hulking figure with a bat, lunged toward Elijah. Instinct took over. Elijah sidestepped the attack, swinging his crowbar in a sharp arc that collided with the man's shoulder. The crack of impact echoed through the yard, followed by the man's pained grunt as he stumbled back. The fight had begun. Chaos erupted as the rest of the gang surged forward. Elijah ducked and weaved, his years of military training guiding his movements. He swung his crowbar with precision, forcing the attackers to back off, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. Shouts and the clang of metal on metal filled the air, the once quiet farm now a battlefield. Then, from the shadows, the families made their move. Henry and a group of men charged out from behind the barn, wielding shovels, hammers, and even pitchforks. Others emerged from the trenches, their tools raised as makeshift weapons. The gang, caught off guard by the sudden reinforcements, stumbled back in confusion. "Now!" Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The families pressed their advantage, using the barricades and trenches to their benefit. The gang's confidence faltered as they realized they were outmaneuvered. The leader's smirk disappeared, replaced by a snarl. "You think this changes anything, Carter? We'll burn this place to the ground." "Not today," Elijah shot back, swinging his crowbar to disarm another attacker. "You underestimated us. That's your mistake." The fight raged on, each side locked in a desperate struggle. But with every passing minute, it became clear that the gang was losing their grip. The families, driven by the need to protect their homes and each other, fought with a ferocity that the gang hadn't expected. The gang surged forward, their numbers seeming to grow in the early morning light as they charged toward the barricades. Elijah Carter stood at the forefront, his crowbar gleaming in his grip, muscles taut as the chaos erupted around him. The air filled with the sound of shouts, the clatter of metal, and the crunch of gravel beneath hurried feet. A gang member lunged at Elijah, swinging a bat with wild intent. Elijah ducked, the bat slicing through the air above him. He pivoted on his heel, driving the end of the crowbar into the man's ribs with a dull thud. The attacker stumbled back, gasping, but Elijah didn't let up. He swung again, the metal connecting with the man's arm, sending him sprawling to the ground. Around him, the community fought with a ferocity born of desperation and determination. Henry, armed with a shovel, blocked the advance of two attackers trying to breach the fence. He swung with a grunt, catching one in the side and forcing him to retreat. A group of teenagers lobbed rocks and clumps of dirt from behind hay bales, their projectiles striking gang members with surprising accuracy. Elijah's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep them at the barricades. Don't let them get inside." A sudden commotion near the barn drew Elijah's attention. Two gang members had managed to flank the defenses, slipping past the trenches and heading straight for the main structure. Elijah's heart pounded as he sprinted toward them, his boots kicking up dust. He caught up to the first man just as he reached the barn doors, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and yanking him backward. The man snarled, twisting to throw a punch, but Elijah blocked it with his forearm. He countered with a sharp jab to the man's stomach, doubling him over, then followed up with an elbow to the side of his head. The second man charged, swinging a chain, but Elijah ducked under the attack and swept the man's legs out from under him. Both attackers were down, groaning in the dirt. Meanwhile, the gang's leader stood near their trucks, barking orders. "Push harder! They're just a bunch of farmers! Break their lines!" The gang rallied, surging forward with renewed aggression. The community, though outnumbered, held their ground. Women and older teens armed with slingshots and makeshift weapons rained down projectiles from behind cover, forcing the gang to slow their advance. Henry shouted from his position at the barricades. "They're trying to come through the east fence. We need backup." Elijah turned, his breath heavy, and motioned to a group of men nearby. "Go with Henry. Hold that fence." The men nodded and sprinted toward the eastern side of the property, their tools raised like weapons. Elijah took a deep breath, scanning the battlefield. The gang's numbers were formidable, but the community's determination was holding them back. For now, the tide of the battle began to shift as the gang adjusted their strategy. They started using their weapons more ruthlessly, swinging bats and chains with brutal force. One gang member managed to climb over the barricade, only to be met by a sharp blow from a rake wielded by an elderly farmer. Another attacker slipped through the trenches, but was stopped by a well-aimed rock to the temple, thrown by a teenage girl with fierce precision. Despite these victories, the community was beginning to tire. Their movements grew slower, their strikes less forceful. Elijah could see it, the cracks forming in their defense, the fatigue setting in. The gang's leader noticed too, his grin widening as he stepped forward. "Carter!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You really think this is going to work? Look at them. They're breaking. Just give up now and save yourself the trouble." Elijah's jaw tightened, his grip on the crowbar firm. "Not a chance," he called back, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The leader's grin twisted into a sneer. "Fine. Have it your way. Boys, Time to turn up the heat. The gang's renewed push was brutal. They broke through the barricades in several places, forcing the defenders to fall back toward the center of the property. Elijah fought with everything he had, his crowbar a blur as he blocked and countered attacks. His muscles burned, but he refused to let up. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't let them take another step." A gang member swung a chain at Elijah, the metal whistling through the air. Elijah sidestepped, grabbing the chain and yanking it out of the man's hands. He swung the crowbar in a wide arc, catching the attacker in the side and sending him crashing to the ground. Amid the chaos, unexpected reinforcements arrived. From behind the barn, a group of neighbors who had been delayed in joining the fight appeared, armed with pitchforks and axes. Their arrival bolstered the community's morale, and they launched a counterattack with renewed vigor. Elijah saw the shift, the way the gang faltered at the sight of the reinforcements. "Push them back!" he shouted, raising his crowbar high. "We can do this!" The battle raged on, the tide constantly shifting as both sides fought with everything they had. The gang's arrogance began to crack under the weight of the community's resilience, but the fight was far from over. The fight raged on, chaos swallowing the farm, as Elijah Carter squared off against one of the largest gang members he had encountered yet. The man's towering frame and scarred knuckles hinted at a history of violence, and the crowbar in his hands was swung with wild, unrelenting force. Elijah ducked as the first swing came in, the whoosh of air close enough to ruffle his shirt. He shifted his weight and came back up with a counter-strike, his own crowbar smashing into the man's ribs. The hit landed hard, and the man grunted, but instead of falling back, he barreled forward, slamming a shoulder into Elijah's chest. The impact knocked Elijah off balance, forcing him to stumble a few steps. He adjusted quickly, bringing his weapon back up just in time to deflect another powerful swing. Sparks flew as the two crowbars collided, the sound ringing out over the din of the larger fight. "You're tough," the man growled, his breath heavy as he closed in again. "But you're slowing down." Elijah didn't answer. He lunged forward, faking a low strike before pivoting and aiming high. The feint worked. The man raised his weapon to block, exposing his side. Elijah swung hard, his crowbar connecting with the man's hip. The force of the blow sent him staggering to the side, but he recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing in fury. The next swing came fast and wild. Elijah barely had time to react as the metal bar slammed into his shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, and his grip faltered for a split second. The gang member saw the opening and pressed his advantage, charging at Elijah with a roar. Elijah twisted his body, using the momentum of the man's charge to sidestep and bring his crowbar up in a sharp arc. The blow caught the man under the chin, snapping his head back. He staggered, his grip on his own weapon loosening. Elijah didn't waste the moment. He closed the gap, driving his knee into the man's midsection. The gang member doubled over with a grunt, but as Elijah raised his crowbar for another strike, the man lashed out, catching Elijah in the ribs with a desperate punch. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he stumbled back, gasping for air. The two men circled each other, both breathing heavily, their movements slower now, but no less dangerous. Blood trickled down the side of Elijah's face from a cut on his forehead, while the gang member spat onto the ground, wiping at his bleeding lip with the back of his hand. "You should have stayed down," the man snarled, his voice low and venomous. Elijah didn't reply. He stepped forward, feinting with his crowbar before switching his grip and swinging low. The weapon caught the man's shin, and the sickening crunch of bone echoed in the air. The gang member howled in pain, dropping to one knee. Elijah raised his crowbar again, this time bringing it down hard across the man's arm. The weapon clattered to the ground as the gang member let out a guttural scream, clutching his injured limb. Elijah kicked the crowbar away, his breath coming in short bursts as he stood over the fallen man. The gang member, his face twisted in pain, glared up at Elijah. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think one fight makes a difference?" Elijah's gaze was cold, unyielding. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and moved back toward the fray, his crowbar still gripped tightly in his hand. The battle around him was as chaotic as ever. Gang members and community fighters clashed in brutal melees, the shouts and grunts of combat filling the air. Near the barn, Henry was locked in a fierce struggle with two attackers, using his shovel to block and counter their strikes. Behind a stack of hay bales, a group of teenagers fired rocks from slingshots, forcing a cluster of gang members to duck for cover. Elijah pressed forward, his movements steady, despite the pain in his shoulder and ribs. A smaller gang member darted toward him, swinging a chain wildly. Elijah deflected the first strike, stepping inside the man's reach and driving his elbow into his chest. The gang member stumbled, and Elijah followed up with a sharp strike to his knee, sending him crumpling to the ground. As the tide of the fight shifted, the gang's confidence began to waver. Their initial aggression gave way to hesitation as they realized the community wasn't breaking as easily as they'd expected. But the battle was far from over, and Elijah could feel the weight of every blow, every decision. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Blood and dust mingled in the air, and the cries of the wounded underscored the relentless violence. Elijah wiped the sweat and blood from his face, his grip tightening on his crowbar as he prepared for the next attack. Dust and sweat clung to Elijah's skin as he moved through the chaos, his crowbar gripped tightly in his hands. Around him, the community pushed back with unwavering determination, their coordinated efforts forcing the gang to retreat toward the outskirts of the property. From behind a stack of hay bales, a group of teenagers launched a volley of rocks with slingshots, striking two gang members in rapid succession. One cursed loudly, clutching his temple, while the other stumbled and fell. Near the barn, Henry stood tall, swinging his shovel like a weapon of war, driving two attackers back toward the fence. Elijah, wiping blood and sweat from his brow, surveyed the scene with a glimmer of hope. They were holding the line. The gang, once so sure of their dominance, now looked disorganized and hesitant. For every push they made, the community met them with greater force. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was. But Elijah began to believe they could win. "They're falling back," Henry shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We've got 'em on the run," Elijah nodded, adrenaline surging through him as he advanced toward the gang's leader. The man stood near their trucks, his expression darkening as he watched his men falter. "It's over," Elijah called out, his voice steady and commanding. "Take your men and leave, or this ends worse for you." The leader's eyes flicked to Elijah, his smirk replaced by a scowl. For a moment, it seemed as if he might give the order to retreat. But then, with a sharp whistle, he motioned to two of his men near one of the trucks. They scrambled to the vehicle, yanking something from the back, a heavy object wrapped in canvas. Elijah's stomach sank as realization dawned. "What are they?" The answer came before he could finish the thought. A deafening explosion shattered the air, the shockwave ripping through the farm as the gang detonated the barricade on the east side of the property. The force sent debris flying in all directions, the wooden planks splintering like matchsticks. A thick cloud of dust and smoke billowed outward, obscuring the battlefield and throwing everything into chaos. Elijah stumbled back, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He caught himself against a fence post, coughing as the acrid smell of smoke filled his lungs. Around him, the community faltered, their once coordinated efforts dissolving into confusion and fear. "They blew the barricade!" someone shouted, panic lacing their voice. "They're coming through!" Through the haze, Elijah saw the gang surge forward, their numbers bolstered by the sudden breach. They moved with renewed aggression, their earlier hesitation replaced by a ruthless determination. One gang member swung a chain, catching a young man across the shoulder and sending him sprawling to the ground. Another barreled through the trenches, kicking over piles of tools and scattering the defenders. "Elijah!" Henry's voice cut through the din, desperate and strained. "They're breaking through. We need to regroup." Elijah forced himself to his feet, his body protesting every movement. His shoulder throbbed from the earlier blow, and his ribs ached with every breath. But he pushed the pain aside. "Fall back to the center," he shouted, his voice hoarse but firm. "Everyone, fall back and hold the line." The community scrambled to obey, retreating toward the heart of the property. They moved quickly, pulling injured fighters with them and dragging what supplies they could carry. Elijah stayed at the front, swinging his crowbar with precision to cover their retreat. He struck one gang member in the knee, dropping him with a pained yell, before turning to block another attacker's wild swing. The gang pressed their advantage, pouring through the breach like a flood. They shouted taunts and threats as they advanced, their confidence restored by the chaos. "This is what happens when you stand against us," one of them bellowed, his voice thick with triumph. "You should have left when you had the chance." Near the center of the farm, the defenders regrouped around the barn and the main house, using the fortified structures as their last line of defense. Martha and a few others worked quickly to tend to the injured, their hands steady despite the fear etched on their faces. Elijah joined them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't let them push any further," he said, his voice low but urgent. "This is it. We hold here, or we lose everything." Henry nodded, gripping his shovel tightly. "We're with you, Elijah. No matter what." Elijah looked around, meeting the eyes of the men and women who had fought so bravely. Despite the fear and exhaustion on their faces, he saw something else: resolve. They weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. He turned back toward the advancing gang, raising his crowbar as he stepped forward. "We've come this far," he said, his voice steady. "We're not letting them take another step." The battered community clung to their makeshift defenses near the center of the farm. Smoke from the destroyed barricades still lingered in the air, mixing with the dust and sweat of a brutal, drawn-out battle. The gang, emboldened by the explosion, pressed closer, their shouts carrying through the chaos. Elijah Carter wiped the blood from his face, his ribs aching as he forced himself forward through the melee. Around him, the community fought valiantly, but the tide of the battle had turned against them. Gang members, wielding bats and chains, pushed through the defenses, scattering the exhausted defenders. For every small victory the community managed, the gang seemed to answer with even greater brutality. Elijah's eyes locked on the gang leader, standing at the center of the assault. The man shouted orders, his red bandana a glaring symbol of his authority. His chain swung lazily at his side, his confidence radiating even as his men battered their way through the farm. Elijah's jaw tightened as he adjusted his grip on the crowbar. The leader wasn't just their commander. He was their morale. If the gang was going to break, it had to start with him. Elijah moved with purpose, weaving through the chaos. A gang member stepped in his path, swinging a bat in a vicious arc. Elijah deflected the blow with his crowbar, stepping inside the man's reach and slamming the weapon into his knee. The attacker crumpled, clutching his leg. But Elijah didn't stop. He pushed forward, his focus locked on the leader. The leader noticed Elijah's approach and smirked, stepping out from the fray. "Carter!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din. "Coming to surrender?" Elijah didn't answer. He lunged, his crowbar slicing through the air. The leader sidestepped, snapping his chain toward Elijah's legs. Elijah jumped back, the chain striking the dirt where he'd stood. The two men circled each other, their movements tense and deliberate. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," the leader sneered. "But this fight's already over. Look around you, Carter. Your people are done." Elijah feinted, drawing the leader off balance. He stepped in close, driving his crowbar into the man's side. The leader grunted, but swung his chain wildly, forcing Elijah to back off. They clashed again, their weapons colliding in a furious exchange of strikes and counters. Elijah's muscles burned, but he refused to let up. Finally, with a sharp twist, Elijah disarmed the leader, the chain flying from his hand. Elijah stepped forward, tackling the man to the ground. They grappled, the leader thrashing beneath him. But Elijah drove his knee into the man's chest, pinning him down. He grabbed the discarded chain and looped it around the leader's neck, pulling it tight. The leader gasped, his hands clawing at the chain. But Elijah held firm. "Call them off," Elijah growled, his voice low and deadly. "Now!" The sight of their leader subdued spread through the gang like wildfire. One by one, the attackers faltered, their movements slowing as they noticed Elijah standing over their commander. The community, battered but determined, seized the moment to regroup, forming a protective circle around Elijah. "Enough!" Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over! Drop your weapons, or he doesn't leave this farm." The gang hesitated, their eyes darting between Elijah and their struggling leader. One of them, a burly man with a bat, stepped forward. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice wavered. "Try me," Elijah shot back, yanking the chain tighter. The leader let out a strangled gasp, his face reddening as his struggles slowed. The gang member took a step back, uncertainty etched across his face. Elijah scanned the group, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "Drop your weapons," he barked. Now, one by one, the gang members began to comply, their weapons clattering to the ground. The sound of bats and chains hitting the dirt was like a release of tension, a shift in the tide. But the moment remained charged, the gang's hesitation laced with the potential for violence. "You're making a mistake," the leader rasped, his voice strained but defiant. "You think this changes anything? They'll come back for me, and for you." Elijah leaned down, his voice cold. "If anyone comes back, they'll find more than a fight waiting for them. Now, tell your men to leave." The leader hesitated, his defiance flickering. Elijah pulled the chain tighter, the pressure unmistakable. "Do it!" The leader relented, his voice a harsh bark. "Stand down, everyone! Back to the trucks!" The gang members shuffled backward, their earlier confidence shattered. The community stayed vigilant, their tools raised as the gang retreated. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Elijah didn't let go of the leader, his grip on the chain unwavering. "Not until they're gone," he said to the man struggling beneath him. The gang lingered near their trucks, muttering among themselves. But the message was clear. The power had shifted. The community stood firm in a defensive circle, their weapons raised, but the tension remained thick in the air. Despite their apparent retreat, the gang's presence felt like a coiled snake, ready to strike the moment an opportunity presented itself. Elijah tightened his grip on the chain wrapped around the gang leader's neck. The man, now kneeling in the dirt, coughed and gasped for air, but still managed to glare up at Elijah with a defiance that refused to waver. His voice, though hoarse, carried a sharp edge as he broke the silence. "So, what's it gonna be, Carter?" he rasped, his lips curling into a bitter sneer. "You gonna take me out here and now? Because if you don't, we're just gonna come back. You know that, right?" Elijah didn't respond immediately. His heart pounded as the leader's words hung in the air, the weight of their truth pressing down on him. Around him, the sounds of the battlefield had faded into a tense stillness, every eye fixed on the standoff at the center of the yard. The leader continued, his voice low but cutting. "You think you've won something today? This isn't over. You take me out, and my boys will come for you. You let me live, and we'll be back. With more men, more weapons. Either way, you lose." Elijah's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he held the chain. His mind raced, the enormity of the situation crashing down on him. The leader wasn't bluffing. The gang's threats weren't empty. And Elijah knew that this moment, this decision, would define everything that came next. "You don't have to do this, Elijah," Martha's voice called from the group behind him. Her tone was soft, but it carried a plea that cut through the tension. "We've already won. Let him go." Elijah glanced back at her, his eyes meeting hers. The concern etched on her face was mirrored in the expressions of the others. Fear, hope, and a fragile sense of relief that they'd made it this far. But even as he looked at them, the gang leader's words echoed in his ears. louder than anything else. "You don't get it, do you?" the leader hissed, sensing Elijah's hesitation. "You think they're scared of you? Of this little farm and your ragtag group of farmers? You've just pissed them off. You think you're protecting these people, but you're putting a target on their backs." "Shut up!" Elijah snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the man for a moment. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. The gang leader smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You know I'm right. You've got two choices, Carter. Either you finish this now, or you let me walk, and I'll show you what happens when you mess with us." Elijah's grip on the chain faltered for the briefest of moments, and the leader noticed. He chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You don't have it in you, do you? You're not a killer. You're just some old Marine trying to play hero." The words hit harder than Elijah expected. He'd faced enemies before, real enemies, ones who didn't hesitate to take lives. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield in a faraway land. This was his home, his community, and the stakes were far more personal. He glanced at the gang, their postures tense as they watched the standoff unfold. They weren't leaving. Not really. They were waiting, testing his resolve. And behind him, the community he'd fought so hard to protect stood silently, their trust and hope resting squarely on his shoulders. Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The weight of the chain in his hands felt heavier than ever, and the leader's mocking smirk burned into his mind. He couldn't let the man go, not without ensuring the safety of everyone who had stood by his side. But the alternative was unthinkable. "What are you going to do, Carter?" the leader pressed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna cross that line? You think killing me solves your problem? It just makes you like us." Elijah opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto the leader's. "I'm nothing like you," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And you're not walking away from this without consequences." The leader raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering for a split second. "Oh yeah? And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're done," Elijah replied. He yanked the chain, forcing the leader to his feet. "You and your men are leaving, and if you or anyone else tries to come back here, you won't get another chance." The gang leader hesitated, his bravado cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of doubt. He glanced at his men, who stood frozen by their trucks, waiting for his next move. Elijah didn't let up, his grip on the chain unyielding as he dragged the man closer to the edge of the confrontation. The tension in the air was suffocating, every second feeling like an eternity. The community held their breath, their eyes locked on Elijah as he faced the impossible choice before him. The gang waited too, their earlier confidence replaced by an uneasy silence. Elijah's next words would decide everything. The silence that followed Elijah's command was thick with tension, the gang members shifting uneasily as they glanced between each other and their subdued leader. The makeshift battlefield of the farmyard still bore the scars of their violent assault, broken barricades, scattered weapons, and the dust of chaos settling in the air. Yet now, the gang's confidence had crumbled, replaced with the raw uncertainty of men whose leader was at the mercy of their enemy. Elijah's grip on the chain didn't falter as he stepped forward, dragging the gang leader with him. The man stumbled, his defiant sneer now edged with discomfort as the chain pressed against his neck. "It's over," Elijah said firmly, his voice cutting through the heavy stillness. "You're done here. Every single one of you." One of the gang members, a wiry man near the front, shook his head. "You think this changes anything, Carter? You've got one man. We've still got numbers." Elijah's sharp glare pinned him in place. "Then try me," he said coldly, the quiet steel in his voice daring anyone to move. "You think numbers will help you when every single one of you ends up in cuffs? Or worse?" The wiry man faltered, his bravado wavering. Elijah shifted his attention to the rest of the group, his gaze sweeping over them like a blade. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his tone steady and unrelenting. "You're going to take responsibility for what you've done. No excuses, no running. You're going to drop everything your weapons, your keys, and you're going to kneel. Right here. Right now. The gang members hesitated, their glances darting to their leader. The man in Elijah's grasp let out a harsh laugh, though it was strained under the weight of the chain. "You really think they'll listen to you?" he rasped. "You think you can make them?" Elijah yanked the chain, cutting him off with a choking sound. "I don't think," Elijah said, his voice sharp as a knife. "I know." One of the gang members, a younger man near the back, shuffled nervously. "He's serious," the man muttered to the others. "Just do it. This isn't worth it." "Shut up!" another gang member snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. Elijah stepped forward again, dragging the leader with him. "Who's next?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Who's going to stand up and take responsibility for what you've done? Or are you all cowards hiding behind this man?" The insult stung, its effect rippling through the gang like a spark. One by one, the men began to lower their weapons, tossing them to the ground with reluctant movements. The wiry man was the last to comply, his defiant expression souring as he finally dropped his crowbar. "Kneel!" Elijah commanded, his voice brooking no argument. The gang members hesitated, but the sight of their leader struggling in Elijah's grip broke the last of their resistance. Slowly, grudgingly, they sank to their knees in the dirt. Their earlier arrogance now reduced to bitter compliance. Elijah took a slow breath, his grip on the chain easing slightly. Behind him, the community watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. They'd fought hard, enduring fear and pain to protect their homes, and now they stood victorious, not through violence, but through sheer will and resilience. Elijah turned his attention back to the gang. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to stay exactly where you are. You're not going to move, you're not going to speak, and you're sure as hell not going to think about running. You've already done enough damage, and I'm not giving you a chance to do more." The gang leader chuckled weakly, his voice rough from the pressure of the chain. "And then what, Carter? You think the sheriff's just gonna come down here and do his job? You think he'll arrest us?" Elijah's jaw tightened, the weight of the man's words settling on him. The sheriff's history of indifference and selective enforcement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. But Elijah had made his choice. "He won't have a choice," Elijah said firmly. "Not this time." He looked back at Martha, who had already stepped forward with her phone in hand. "Call him," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Tell him to bring everyone he's got." Martha hesitated for a moment, then nodded, dialing with determined fingers. The gang leader watched her, his smirk returning despite his situation. "Good luck with that," he muttered. "You think you've won, but all you've done is paint a bigger target on your back." Elijah didn't respond, his focus on the moment. He knew the risks, knew that this wasn't the end, but as he looked around at the community, their battered faces shining with quiet triumph, he felt the weight of their trust. This fight wasn't just for his farm. It was for all of them. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the yard as the gang knelt in the dirt, their weapons discarded in a pile nearby. The farmyard was eerily quiet now, the sounds of the earlier chaos replaced by the distant hum of wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. The tension was palpable, stretching thin as both the community and the gang waited for the sheriff to arrive. Elijah Carter stood at the center, the chain still looped around the gang leader's neck, though his grip had loosened slightly. His gaze swept over the gang members, their heads bowed or turned away, each man lost in his own thoughts. The earlier bravado and defiance had all but evaporated, replaced by a simmering unease that threatened to boil over. Near the back of the group, a wiry man broke the silence, muttering loud enough for the others to hear. "This is pointless. We're just sitting here like idiots. We should have left when we had the chance." Another man, his tattoos glinting in the sunlight, snorted. "Yeah? And run where? You think Carter wouldn't come after us? He's got a death grip on our boss." The wiry man sneered, his voice rising. "So what? He's one guy. We're the ones who've got the trucks and the numbers. We could have been halfway to the next county by now. Their whispers turned to low murmurs as the men began to talk amongst themselves, their frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. The younger members shifted nervously, glancing toward the trucks as though considering their options. The wiry man leaned closer to the others, his voice sharp. "Look, we've got nothing to gain sitting here waiting for the cops to show up. This whole thing's gone to hell. I say we make a break for it." Elijah didn't move, but his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "And where exactly do you think you're going to run?" The gang fell silent, their heads snapping toward Elijah. He stepped forward, dragging the gang leader with him, and his voice dropped to a low, commanding tone. "Your leader knows who all of you are. Your names, your faces, everything. You think he won't give you up the second he's staring down a sentence? You think he's going to protect you?" The leader growled, his voice hoarse but defiant. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to turn you against me." Elijah ignored him, his eyes fixed on the gang. "Do you really think he's going to sit in a cell for you? Because I promise you, when it comes down to it, he's going to save himself, and every single one of you will be left holding the bag." The wiry man hesitated, his earlier confidence faltering as Elijah's words sank in. He glanced at the leader, whose expression was tight with suppressed anger. Another gang member, a burly man near the front, shifted uneasily. "What if he's right?" he muttered. "I mean, we've all seen what happens when the heat's on. People talk." The leader snarled, glaring at him. "Shut your mouth. You're all pathetic. You're letting him mess with your heads." Elijah took another step forward, his tone unrelenting. "I'm not messing with anything. I'm just telling you the truth. You've got two choices. You can stick with him and go down together, or you can save yourselves and take responsibility for what you've done." The younger gang members exchanged nervous glances, their resolve crumbling. The wiry man, now visibly rattled, stood up abruptly, raising his hands. "Fine. I'm out. I'm not going to jail because of this idiot." The leader's face twisted in fury. "You traitor! You're nothing without me." The wiry man didn't look back, walking toward the pile of weapons and keys. "I'd rather be nothing than locked up because of you." The rest of the gang followed suit, one by one rising to their feet and stepping away from the leader. Each man carried the weight of his own fear and self-preservation, their earlier loyalty dissolving under the pressure. The leader struggled against Elijah's grip, his voice rising in desperation. "You cowards! You think you'll get a better deal? You think they won't come for you next?" Elijah leaned down, his voice calm but cutting. "Looks like your grip on them wasn't as strong as you thought." The leader growled, his chest heaving as he glared at the men who had abandoned him. "You're all dead. You hear me? You're nothing without me." Elijah straightened, his grip on the chain steady. "Looks like they don't need you after all." As the gang members stood with their hands raised, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Elijah glanced toward the horizon, the flashing lights of police vehicles drawing closer. He turned back to the leader, his expression hard. "Looks like your time just ran out." The leader didn't respond, his face twisted with anger and defeat. The gang members stood silently, their earlier mutterings replaced by the heavy weight of resignation. The sheriff would arrive soon, and this time there would be no turning a blind eye. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense silence that hung over the farm. The gang members, now unarmed and standing with their hands raised, exchanged uneasy glances as the reality of their situation settled in. Elijah Carter stood at the center of it all, his grip still firm on the chain wrapped around the gang leader's neck. The leader, defiant to the end, muttered curses under his breath, his glare fixed on the horizon where the flashing lights approached. The sheriff's car led the convoy, its lights flashing red and blue across the dusty landscape. Several patrol cars followed, their engines roaring as they skidded to a stop at the edge of the farm. The officers stepped out cautiously, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene. A battered community standing firm, weapons scattered in a pile, and a gang of kneeling men subdued in the dirt. Sheriff Daniels, A tall man with a graying mustache and a perpetual air of indifference stepped forward. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, landing on Elijah and the gang leader. "Carter," he called out, his tone measured. "What the hell's going on here?" Elijah met the sheriff's eyes, his own gaze steady and unwavering. "What's going on?" he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Is that these men trespassed on my property, destroyed our defenses, and attacked us. And now, they're yours to deal with." The sheriff's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the gang. The gang leader sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Took you long enough, Daniels. Thought you were on our side." The sheriff's lips thinned, but he didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he turned back to Elijah. "And you've got proof of all this?" Elijah nodded toward the pile of weapons and keys. "There's enough here to start. And if you search their trucks, you'll find everything you need. Documents, evidence of their threats, maybe even connections to the larger network they're part of." The sheriff hesitated, his usual indifference warring with the pressure of the situation. He glanced at the gang members, their postures tense but submissive. Finally, with a sharp breath, he nodded. "All right. Officers, start searching the vehicles. Secure the weapons." As the deputies moved into action, the gang leader growled, his sneer widening. "You really think this is gonna stick, Carter? Daniels here doesn't have the guts to go through with it. He'll let us walk, just like always." The sheriff stiffened, his gaze snapping to the leader. For a moment, his hesitation was palpable, but the weight of the community's eyes on him was heavier still. The people who stood battered but unbroken, the people he'd sworn to protect, were watching, their trust and patience hanging by a thread. Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Not this time, Sheriff. You can't ignore this. Not with all of us here. Not with everything they've done." The sheriff met Elijah's gaze, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of resolve that hadn't been there before. He turned back to the leader, his tone cold. "Shut your mouth, or I'll add resisting arrest to the list." The leader glared at him, but said nothing more. The deputies began pulling bags and papers from the trucks, their discoveries confirming Elijah's claims. One officer held up a folder stuffed with documents, his voice rising. "Sheriff, you're gonna want to see this." Daniels walked over, flipping through the papers with a grim expression. Whatever he saw erased the last of his hesitation. He snapped the folder shut and nodded sharply. "All right, cuff them all." The gang erupted in protests, their earlier defiance replaced by panicked excuses and desperate pleas. "You can't do this," one shouted. "We didn't do anything wrong," another argued, but the deputies ignored them, moving efficiently to bind their wrists with zip ties and read them their rights. The gang leader struggled as two officers approached him, his voice rising in anger. "This is a mistake. You're gonna regret this, Daniels. You don't know who you're messing with." The sheriff's gaze hardened as he stepped closer. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he said, his tone cold. "And it ends here." The leader's protests were silenced as the deputies hauled him to his feet and secured his hands behind his back. Elijah released the chain, stepping back as the officers took over. He watched silently as the gang was rounded up, their once threatening presence reduced to a line of subdued men being loaded into patrol cars. As the last of the gang was secured, the sheriff turned back to Elijah. "We'll handle the rest from here," he said, his tone gruff but respectful. "You did good, Carter. I'll make sure this sticks." Elijah nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "It's not just for me," he said. "It's for all of us." The sheriff gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning to his men. "Let's get this evidence catalogued. I want everything by the book." The farmyard fell quiet again as the patrol cars pulled away, taking the gang and their leader with them. The community began to gather around Elijah, their expressions a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Henry clapped him on the shoulder, a weary smile breaking through the grime on his face. "We did it!" Elijah glanced around at the faces of his neighbors, faces marked by sweat, dirt, and the weight of what they had endured. The farm still bore the scars of the battle: broken barricades, scattered debris, and churned up earth. But they had held their ground. They had won. Elijah managed a faint smile, though his mind was already turning over what came next. "We did," he said quietly, "but it's not just about today. This was a fight to protect what's ours. And we stood together to do it. That's what matters." Martha stepped forward, her arms crossed over her chest. "Do you really think it's over, Elijah? Those men, they're dangerous. Even if the sheriff charges them, what's to stop them from coming back once they're out?" Elijah took a deep breath, wiping a hand over his face. "They might think twice after today," he said. "We didn't give them an inch, and they saw what happens when we stand together. But if they do come back, we'll be ready. What we proved today is that they can't just walk in here and take what they want. Not anymore." The group murmured their agreement, though the exhaustion in their voices was clear. Henry straightened up, using his shovel as a makeshift cane. "We've got work to do," he said, glancing around at the damage. "This place looks like a war zone." "It is," Elijah said, his voice steady, "but it's our land, and we'll rebuild it the same way we defended it. Together." The words seemed to renew the group's resolve. One by one, they began to gather tools and supplies, their movements slow but determined. Martha stayed by Elijah's side, her gaze following the others. "You really think this will hold them off?" she asked. Elijah nodded, though his expression remained serious. "It's not just about the sheriff or the charges. It's about us showing them that we're not afraid, that we're not going anywhere. They can't intimidate us anymore." Martha hesitated, then nodded. "Well, if anyone can make that stick, it's you." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the community worked to clean up the aftermath of the fight. The sense of unity that had carried them through the day was still strong, each person drawing strength from the others. Elijah moved among them, helping where he could, his presence a steady reassurance. Though his body ached and his mind raced with plans for what came next, he knew that they had crossed an important threshold. They had stood together, and they had won. By the time the last remnants of the barricades were cleared away and the tools stored, the farmyard was bathed in the golden glow of sunset. The air was quiet now, filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves. The community gathered one last time near the barn, their faces tired but resolute. Henry looked to Elijah, his expression serious. "We couldn't have done this without you, you know." Elijah shook his head. "You could have. You didn't need me to show you how to fight for what's yours. That was already in you. All I did was remind you of what we're capable of when we stand together." The group nodded, their exhaustion giving way to quiet pride. As they began to disperse, heading back to their homes to rest and recover, Elijah stayed behind, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The scars of the day were still fresh, but so was the determination in his heart. This was their land, their home, and they had proven that they would protect it no matter the cost. As the last of the group disappeared into the twilight, Elijah turned toward the barn, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something else, too. A quiet hope that the fight for their future wasn't just a battle they could win, but one they already had, and they would keep winning, together. The following week, the aftermath of the gang's attack played out in the sheriff's office and the courtroom, both places buzzing with a sense of urgency not often seen in the small town. Sheriff Daniels, usually a figure of indifference, moved with purpose, his demeanor sharp and focused as he oversaw the compilation of charges against the gang. He had spent years brushing off complaints and turning a blind eye to the problems plaguing the black community. But the events on Elijah Carter's farm had changed something. Daniels had felt the weight of Elijah's unwavering gaze as he loaded the gang members into patrol cars. The community had stood united behind Elijah, their resolve and defiance leaving no room for the sheriff to ignore the reality of what had happened. The sheriff knew this wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about ensuring his own legacy. If he handled this case correctly, it could be the kind of high-profile action that earned him a promotion or, at the very least, some much-needed respect in the region. Over the next few days, Daniels worked tirelessly with his deputies to process the evidence collected from the gang's vehicles and the farm. The weapons, documents, and other items found were more than enough to tie the gang to a string of crimes. Not just the attack on Elijah's farm, but other acts of intimidation and violence throughout the area. It was a paper trail that painted a damning picture of the gang's activities. And Daniels knew that failing to act decisively now would be a career-ending mistake. The gang's leader, who had swaggered into the farm with threats and cruelty, now sat behind bars, his arrogance replaced with frustration and simmering anger. His lawyer tried to argue for bail, but Daniels had made sure the evidence was presented in a way that left no room for leniency. The charges ranged from trespassing and destruction of property to assault and conspiracy, each one backed by irrefutable proof. The leader's protests that the case was blown out of proportion fell on deaf ears, and bail was denied. For the rest of the gang, the story was much the same. One by one, they faced arraignments and hearings. Their attempts to minimize their involvement met with mounting evidence that tied them to the crimes. Daniels ensured that the prosecuting attorneys had everything they needed, knowing that a strong case would not only keep the gang off the streets, but also solidify his own reputation as someone who had taken decisive action. Back on the farm, Elijah and the rest of the community watched the developments with cautious optimism. Martha, always one to keep an ear to the ground, brought updates from the courthouse. The sheriff's making a big deal out of this, she told Elijah one evening as they sat on the porch. He's talking about how this case is proof that no one's above the law. Word is, he's even got some people from the state's office looking at him for a promotion. Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Good, he said simply. If ambition is what it takes to make him do his job, then so be it. As long as those men don't come back here, I don't care what motivates him. Martha leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. You know, you could have a future in politics yourself, Elijah. The way you handled all of this, people are starting to talk about how you've brought us together. Elijah chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm no politician. I just did what needed to be done, that's all. In the weeks that followed, the gang's trials became a turning point for the community. The black residents of the area, long accustomed to being overlooked and ignored, found a renewed sense of confidence in their ability to stand up for themselves. The sentences handed down were stiff enough to send a clear message. This kind of intimidation wouldn't be tolerated. The gang leader received the harshest penalty, his years behind bars ensuring he wouldn't pose a threat again anytime soon. The rest of the gang members faced similar fates, their influence in the area effectively dismantled. For Elijah and the community, it was enough. The farm, still bearing the scars of the attack, became a symbol of their resilience and unity. The sheriff's sudden interest in enforcing the law, whether driven by genuine change or personal gain, provided a measure of security that had been absent for too long. As the days turned into weeks, the tension that had hung over the town began to lift, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of hope. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Elijah stood at the edge of his property, watching the golden light stretch across the land. Henry approached, a satisfied smile on his face. "Feels different now, doesn't it?" he said, nodding toward the horizon. "Safer." Elijah nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. "It does, but it's not just because of what happened in town. It's because we showed them what we're made of, that we're not going to be scared off or pushed around." Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "You're right about that. We've got each other's backs now, more than ever, and no one's gonna take that away." As the two men stood in the fading light, the farm quiet around them, there was a sense that the fight wasn't just about one day or one gang. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, about proving that resilience and unity could overcome even the darkest challenges. For Elijah, it wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about ensuring a future where no one would have to fight that battle again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.